Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am so happy to be in your faces once again. I know that some of you are just stopping by here for the first time. My name is Chioma. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is going to be about people who end up not enjoying their relocation experience. I might even go as far as saying that some people end up regretting coming to Australia. Australia is not for everybody. Relocating is not for everybody. And I am only saying Australia because that's the context that I have, right? I live in Australia, so I can only speak from that point of view. The very first group of people I want to address would be professional career people. So these are people, I'm not just talking about entry-level staff. I'm not talking about people who have just started a career. So these are people who are quite established in their career, then having to face the prospect of abandoning everything and moving to another country where they either have to start all over from scratch in the same career, or in some cases are not even able to get back into their career. Yes, that happens for some people, unfortunately. And this is where, as I have always said on this channel, it is so important that you're doing your research, okay? Your research should not only cover visa options, visa requirements, and things like that. You want to go further than that and find out what exactly life is going to look like for you. Will you be able to break back into your career? What are the hurdles? If you're someone for who the prospect of having to start all over again from scratch, or maybe from a much junior position, is giving you very anxious thoughts and feelings, then you really want to drill down on your research and find out whether there are ways to get around that hurdle. Now, when I say this, the profession that readily comes to mind would be in the medical profession. I am not necessarily addressing nurses here. I am talking about doctors and maybe other medical specialists. So here in Australia, I don't have the full information, but I know that there are certifications, exams you have to take. There are different councils and boards that you need to be part of. And if you don't have all those things already, then you're not able to practice here in Australia. And this applies to anybody, regardless of your level of qualification from your country of training. As long as you want to practice in Australia, then all these conditions apply. What I have observed is that, unfortunately, some people have struggled to the extent where they were never able to get back into their medical profession here in Australia. I have seen people who have packed up and left as a result of that frustration. I have seen other people who have completely abandoned their career, not because they wanted to, but just because they kind of gave up. They got tired of attempting and never passing. And as you can imagine, for people like that, it is even more frustrating because some of them end up in survival jobs that they never, ever envisioned themselves doing for the long term. And some of them change into careers that they are not happy with. This is the time for you to be honest with yourself about what you can and can't accept in your career progression and your career journey. Another profession where I see a steep barrier to entry is in the law profession as well. Please don't ask me questions about this occupation, that occupation. Okay, I'm only talking from my observations. I don't know what obtains in every single occupation. So if you're someone who is already established in their profession or in their career, and you would ideally want to get back into the same career, even if you don't mind starting at a lower level to build up again, one thing I would suggest is that you hop online and try to find out information about people going through the same process as yourself. Use your Facebook wisely. There are lots of groups on there that you can find. There are also online forums like Quora, Reddit. Yeah, maybe you would find some useful information in some of these unlikely places. Okay. So that's number one. And then following on very closely from that would be the dependent family members who are also professional career people. And the reason I want to speak specifically to dependents is because depending on the kind of visa that brings you into Australia as a dependent, chances are that you might have some restrictions that apply to you as well. For instance, if the primary visa holder is on a student visa and they are studying towards a bachelor degree, then you as the dependent family member member who is of the age to work, probably you're a spouse or a partner, you will also be restricted to the number of working hours as the primary student visa holder. So where the student visa holder is not able to work beyond 24 hours a week and 48 hours a fortnight, the same conditions apply to you. Now, I have seen situations where some primary visa holders, especially on the student visa, do not apply for their dependent ones to join them until they have completed their studies and gone on to a more stable visa that allows everybody to work full time. I am not saying that this is a right or a wrong approach. I am just saying you consider what is best for you, because some of those restrictions might limit your opportunities. For instance, you might want to get back into your career, but find that not a lot of employers are willing to hire you because you're only available to work part-time. Moving on to the second thing, and for this one, I have kind of lumped a few different things together under the same umbrella. And this is the umbrella of culture differences. I have seen so much in relation to the difference in culture that makes people, even if they don't outrightly regret coming here, it leaves them questioning whether they made the right decision to come here. Of course, if you're coming from a conservative culture into a more progressive and liberal one, it is understandable to expect some friction every once in a while and in relation to different things like socially acceptable behavior. It might be things to do with traditional values or the kind of values that you've always held before coming into your host country. So traditional values, gender roles and expectations, things like that. I am sure you know exactly what I am talking about. So where I have seen people question whether they did the right thing would be when they come in here and they are confronted with values that are at odds with what they hold, okay, the principles that they hold or the values that they hold. Some of the areas that I think have been really prominent in my own experience would be families coming in with children and raising children across cultures, especially if you're coming in with young children who are, for the most part, going to receive most of their socialization here in Australia than in the culture that you've come from. You're suddenly going to see yourself in a position where you, as a parent, are a representation of your culture from back home, but then your children seem to be swinging in the opposite direction because this is the culture that they are growing up in. This is the culture where, like I said, they are being socialized into. Your children may not have as strong a connection as you have to your home country. And I have seen a lot of parents struggle with this. So here on this channel, I have had some parents ask me pointed questions about things like discipline in school for kids. And usually when I get that kind of comment, I try to gauge where that person is coming from, what culture that person is coming from. Now, if it is clear that that comment is coming from a Nigerian, I know exactly what they mean when they say discipline in schools. I know what kind of discipline they expect. Of course, here in Australia, the system is very different. So if you're expecting a culture where discipline means corporal punishment in some cases or very hardline stances on things, you're not going to get that here, okay? There is a more progressive approach towards managing behaviors from kids, even challenging behaviors. I have also seen parents here who question whether they did the right thing bringing their kids here, because even the parents themselves are struggling to understand the host culture. And so when the children are behaving a certain way, they find that they are not able to manage those behaviors the way they would have managed those behaviors back home, because the approach here and the system here is very different. But that is just an example. This goes into several other aspects of, the social culture here and the things that you might find confronting if you're coming from a conservative background. Believe it or not, I have seen people who, after several years of being here, they've decided that they want to go back on the basis of these culture differences, which is something to be cautious about, because these things might not come to the fore as soon as you relocate. You may not notice these things, or even if you do, they've not yet become a big issue for you. But further down the track, the more you integrate within the society, the more you come into closer contact with those aspects of the culture here, you might begin to question. And that questioning for some people would lead to regrets or lead to the point where they begin to consider whether going back home would not be the best thing for them. The next point I want to make would be in relation to human rights. Okay, yes, I know that that sounds really funny and off, but to be honest, when I thought about how to coin this next section, nothing was really coming to mind that sounded intelligent enough. And so I just decided I'm going to call it human rights, okay? But again, it's a bunch of different things that I have lumped into that point. It is linked very closely to what I was saying previously about culture differences. Why I decided to discuss this as a separate item is because under this is where you have the law in relation to what is acceptable behavior, what is socially acceptable, what is legally acceptable. Some of us coming from cultures where, as a result of the kind of values that we hold, certain things are condoned, okay, certain things are seen as normal. You need to be careful to know that those things are not considered normal here. And in some instances, they might even be crossing the line into criminal offenses or criminal behavior. What I have seen in this regard, without opening up a can of worms or going into another kind of discussion altogether, what I have seen predominantly in issues that fall within this area would be certain behaviors that might be classified as abuse. They might even be considered criminal behavior. So abuse of children, spousal abuse. So this is where we talk about domestic and family violence or intimate partner violence, okay? Sexual violence as well. You might be coming from a place where some of these things are not a big deal, but here in Australia, they might actually constitute a big offense, okay? Just recently here in New South Wales, which is the state that I live in, there's been some legislative focus on coercive control. And I believe that from July of this year, it will be made into legislation, which means that anyone found to be guilty of using coercive and controlling behaviors towards their partner will potentially be facing some kind of criminal charge. Now, when we look at the extent of behaviors that fall within coercive control, it might be things that some people do not even consider to be anything serious. For instance, monitoring your partner's movements electronically or stalking them, isolating them, all those things that for some people constitutes what they see as traditions and values that they've always held, coming into a place where suddenly those things you've always seen as normal become a criminal offense can be quite confronting, which is why, as I said, beyond just looking at what visa allows you to come into Australia, you also want to research extensively on what the lifestyle here is like, because the last thing you want to do is to end up in jail and having to face the law on the basis of behaviors that you consider to be normal. I have just used coercive control as an example, but there's lots of different things, okay? So let me just dip my foot into this. But like I said, I'm not trying to open up a conversation. Something that I have seen recently online, I've seen a lot of this recently online, will be debates about why relationships and marriages in particular crash once people move abroad. Yeah. And if you ask the men, they have a lot to say about why, and usually they are pointing fingers at the women. And if you ask the women, they are also pointing fingers in the opposite direction. So what I am saying here is that people really need to be careful, okay? These are things that you need to be discussing as a couple, as partners. You need to be discussing these things before you leave. Because ultimately, some of the frustrations you might feel after you relocate to that other country might push you into exhibiting behaviors that will cross over into criminal territory if you're not careful. As I mentioned earlier, these are not things that people readily consider, because when they're thinking about relocating, they just want to take that step in front of their nose. They are not thinking beyond that first step they have to take, which is to get a visa into the country. But what use is it that you spend all that time, you spend all that money, you put in all that time only to end up regretting that decision you took, and knowing that going back home, yes, even though that might always be an option, it is not an easy option. Okay, for many people, a lot goes into the decision to relocate to another country. And when I say a lot, I want you to think material resources, mental resources, emotional resources. Now, to have to pull all of that back and uproot your lives again to go back home and start all over from scratch is not as easy as some people think. So when people come online and they're like, hey, if you don't like it there, you better come back home. Why are you still there? Why don't you go back home? It is not that easy. How many times as an adult can you uproot your life from a place to replant in another place and then have to uproot again and just keep moving back and forth? It's not an easy thing. So of course, before you make that move, you want to think about it carefully. And then the very last thing I am going to talk about, remember, these are just some of the things that make people regret. So I would like to hear your opinions. I would like to hear your comments. If you know of any other factors that affect people's relocation experiences and how it might make them end up regretting, please leave that in the comment section. So the last thing I want to talk about is financial discipline. This is a big one, people. Again, it is one of those things that can creep up on you when you relocate. It's one of those things that if you're not careful, okay, by the time you realize what is happening, you're already neck deep in the problem. This is a society that runs on credits. Let's just put it that way. It's so easy to access credit. Of course, there might still be certain checks that need to be done depending on what you're getting that credit facility for. For instance, if you were going to buy a house, which means you're taking out a mortgage, there are a few other approvals or steps that you have to take to show financial capacity to service a mortgage, yes. But for the most part, if you're that kind of person who wants to get the latest iPhone, you want to drive the latest car brand in the model that you like, you know, if you're that kind of person who is quite hung up on getting all these flashy new material things, it's actually relatively easy here. In some cases, you don't even need to show a bank statement. You don't need to show your bank account to demonstrate that you're able to service a loan. Just the fact that you can provide pay slips to prove that you have a steady source of income is enough for you to be able to buy a phone on credits, is enough for you to buy a laptop on credits, you know, smaller items, but it can also grow to the point where you're taking out a car loan or even taking out a mortgage that you're actually not able to service. In recent years, especially since COVID, we've seen an upsurge of people going into mortgage distress. These are people who borrowed beyond their capacity. Okay, it can be very easy for that to happen if you're not financially savvy, you're not financially prudent, and especially if you're financially ignorant. Okay, so for some people, it's not the case that they outrightly go out to live above their means. It is just the fact that they really do not know or have enough knowledge about how to manage their finances to be able to make prudent choices with their money. Financial discipline is really important here. Otherwise, you could very easily fall into debt. And you know how it is when you're living in a situation where you're dreading checking your emails because you don't know what other letter is there warning you about a debt you're in or warning you about debt recovery coming after you. Yeah, I have seen people who have fallen into this trap, and even if they don't regret coming, these are people who constantly question whether they could have done better and whether it was the right thing even coming here in the first place, knowing that it's not like back home in Nigeria, for example, where if you own something, you own it outrightly. So you don't want to come here and be that person who is servicing so much debt that you don't have anything left over to actually enjoy your life. If you think of any other things that make people regret why they have moved, please leave them in the comment section. Don't forget to like this video before you go, and I am hoping to see you again in my next one. Bye-bye.